Hey folks, my name is John Lay, and welcome back to the channel. Okay, now that I've spent the past few videos talking about the historical chapters in Ode to My Father, now I want to talk about the movie itself. Now, as some of you might know, the very first video that I made for this channel was to talk about this movie. And there's a reason why, even though that video had been deleted, I decided to come back to talk about this movie for several videos. A lot of South Korean movies have already talked about South Korean history, but most movies talk about only one specific chapter of history and they just focus on that. But Ode to My Father does this unique thing where they talk about South Korean history from 1950 to the present day. That's a lot of history to cover, and that's why I found this movie so fascinating. Now, Ode to My Father deals with a lot of sad historical chapters. It starts from the Korean War and it talks about the poverty that followed. Of course, there's going to be a lot of sad themes to it. But, in the end, Ode to My Father is a movie that celebrates South Korea's triumphs. Now, I'm not saying this just because I'm Korean. It's objectively true that South Korea is a miracle. Now, what do I mean by South Korea is a miracle? Well, imagine for a moment that you took a time machine to travel back into the past. You used a time machine to go back to South Korea in August 1953. In August 1953, it's only been a few days since the Korean War had been suspended. Everywhere you would have looked, there would have been destitution and destruction. South Korea did not look anything like it does today back in 1953. Millions of people had died. There was destruction everywhere. In fact, the destruction was so severe that at the time, no one believed that either South or North Korea could ever recover from the war. Now, using this time machine, this is the South Korea you travel back to. And you go up on a stage and you begin to talk. And you talk to anyone who's willing to listen. And you begin to tell people that in less than 70 years, South Korea is going to become one of the world's wealthiest nations with one of the most powerful armies. People all over the world will be driving South Korean cars. South Korean music and movies will be getting critical acclaim. There will be a time when more people around the world will be looking at South Korea in admiration than in abject pity. How many people in 1953 do you think would have believed you? The story that you would have told these people would have seemed so unrealistic and so fantastical that there would have been a better chance that you would have been lobotomized at a mental institute. But that is actually what ended up happening. South Korea is a miracle, and Ode to My Father does a wonderful job of putting that into film. Now, of course, this miracle was built on the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of people, but it was a miracle nonetheless. But the thing about Ode to My Father is that it's not just any movie, it's a movie that's based on historical events. And because of that, this movie also has to be based on historical facts. And what Ode to My Father does is that it commits the ultimate sin of whitewashing South Korean history. Now, as I said, South Korea is a miracle. But it's not just a miracle because it overcame the Korean War and the poverty that followed. It's also a miracle because it managed to thrive in spite of the decades of dictatorship that it had to endure. But Ode to My Father conveniently neglects all of that. In Ode to My Father, the only South Korean president who makes an appearance is Lee Seung-man. But he doesn't even appear in person. You only get to hear his voice on the radio when he announces that the Korean War had been suspended. The movie doesn't spend one moment to talk about the tens of thousands of people that were ordered to be killed by him because they were suspected of being communists. Now, another South Korean president who doesn't get mentioned but whose presence is felt throughout the entire film is Chung-hee. The decision to send South Korean coal miners and nurses as human collateral to West Germany and the decision to send hundreds of thousands of soldiers to war in Vietnam was all his doing. While it's true that Park Chung-hee often gets credited as the South Korean leader who helped to shape the modern-day South Korean economy, it doesn't change the fact that the man was still a dictator. During his presidency, hundreds, if not thousands of people like poets, artists, protesters, college students, vagrants, and opposition leaders got disappeared or imprisoned or tortured or killed. Not one moment was spared to talk about these people. And yet another South Korean president who doesn't get mentioned is Doo-hwan. Now this movie focuses a bit on 1983 because they focus on the TV show Finding Dispersed Families. But what this movie doesn't mention is that 3 years prior to the event that we see in the movie, there was a Gwangju uprising. In 1980, Doo-hwan had just seized power and had declared martial law. And in the city of Gwangju, people protested against this. In order to ensure that his power remained unchallenged, Doo-hwan ordered the army to quell these protests, and the army did so with extreme prejudice. It is estimated that about 2,000 people were killed in the Gwangju uprising. But again, this movie does not mention these people for even a single moment. As I said earlier, South Korea is a miracle. But it's a miracle because not only did it overcome the Korean War and the poverty that followed, it also overcame the dictatorship that followed. But Ode to My Father doesn't talk about any of this. In Ode to My Father, all of South Korea's problems came from outsiders, from North Korean and Chinese and Vietnamese communists. But it doesn't spend one moment to talk about any of the monsters who lived among us. Unfortunately, whitewashing history was not this movie's only crime. This movie had also a lot of other problematic themes. The first problematic theme is when Toksu appears in this rather unconvincing old man makeup. Now, he's at this park and he's talking to his best friend when he notices that this South Asian migrant couple is being harassed by these racist high school kids. Now, because Toksu had been a migrant worker when he was younger, he knows what it feels like to be a migrant worker in a foreign country. And so he gets indignant on their behalf and he starts to berate these young kids. Now, the reason why this scene is problematic is because of who's being the racist and who's being the tolerant one. Now, I'm not at all denying that South Korea has a racism problem. Of course, South Korea has a racism problem. I mean, just ask Samachiri. But the problem with this scene is that, statistically speaking, in the real world, millennials and Gen Zs have a much higher probability of being open to foreigners than boomers are. But in this scene, it is the old man who is berating these younger kids for being racists. Now, of course, there are young people who are racists, but when people are making a movie or creating any kind of fictional world, this world is meant to tell a story. And so, especially in a fictional setting, symbolism matters. And the symbolism that this movie chose is really problematic. The second problematic scene appears when Toksu is having an argument with his wife. Now, his wife is upset because he's always sacrificing himself for others and never lives his own life. And Toksu says that as the eldest son, it is his responsibility. And just then, the national anthem plays as the South Korean flag is about to be lowered at dusk. And at this point, Toksu places his hand on his chest and he swears allegiance to the flag. So, why is this scene problematic? Now, as I said in a previous video, Toksu is not just meant to portray an ordinary person. He's also meant to symbolize the South Korean state. And this movie is telling the audience that the people should be willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater national good. But how dare anyone demand anyone to make any kind of sacrifices? It's a lot easier to say that sacrifices are needed when you're not the one who's doing the sacrificing, isn't it? Suffice to say, whenever there's a sacrifice being made, there's one who's giving and there's one who's collecting. And the one who's collecting never complains. But the one who gives, what right do we have to demand sacrifices from them? And the final problematic scene in this movie is one that involves casual racism and sexism that's meant to be funny. Now, Toksu is poor and so decides to go to West Germany to work as a coal miner, but he doesn't go alone, he goes with his best friend. As it turns out, his best friend isn't poor. He chooses to go to West Germany because he wants the opportunity to quote-unquote experience white women. But the word that he chooses to use is the word pengma. And the word pengma actually means white horse, but in the modern vernacular, it is often used to describe white women in sexually explicit terms. Now, later on, the best friend does get to quote-unquote experience a white woman, but it turns out that she's much more than he bargained for, because the movie heavily implies that he gets raped by her. And again, this is supposed to be funny. As I said, this movie has some rather problematic themes to it. But let's go back to the part where I said that this movie commits a sin of whitewashing history. Now, South Korean movies don't tend to be shy about talking about historically controversial topics. So why does this movie go about to whitewash history? While I have no way to prove this, I think timing is an important factor. Now, this movie came out in 2014, and at the time, the South Korean president was Park Geun-hye. For those of you who don't know, Park Geun-hye was a daughter of Park Chung-hee, one of the dictators that I mentioned earlier. Now, I have no way to prove that this movie was made to avoid embarrassing the South Korean president. But what I do know is that after Park Geun-hye was impeached in 2017, it was revealed that her government had a blacklist that contained thousands of artists who were critical of the South Korean government. This list contained the names of thousands of actors, directors, producers, poets, artists, writers. And so, although I have no way to prove that this movie was made to avoid embarrassing the South Korean president, considering what was revealed to the public after she was impeached, it does pique one's curiosity, doesn't it? So, is Ode to My Father a good movie? Despite all the criticisms that I just made about this movie, in the end, I think that it's a decent movie, but It's an incomplete movie. As I said, this movie neglects to talk a lot about other things that happened in South Korea's past. To get a better understanding of South Korean history and cinema, I think it's important that audience members complement this movie with other movies such as A Taxi Driver or The Man Standing Next. Now, these other movies have different tones and they emphasize on different aspects of South Korean history. But to truly appreciate the miracle that is South Korea, I think audience members should not only just watch Ode to My Father, but complement it with these other films that I just mentioned. Okay, that about wraps it up. No more videos about Ode to My Father. Now, if you like this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell. And if you have a comment to share, leave it down below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.